Welcome back, everyone. We now begin with the second session of the day with Ronak Onkar, titled Investing with Conviction. Conviction is a very elusive concept. In order to invest, we need to have some degree of confidence in our ability to find and hold on to our investment ideas. Finance literature doesn't define this confidence in a measurable manner. Using the tripod of information, analysis, and behavior, an investor can hope to build conviction in their ideas. In this presentation, Ronak will use these three lenses to evaluate various aspects of investing and understanding businesses as well as understanding ourselves. Ronak heads the research department of PPFAS Mutual Fund. His prior assignments include being a research analyst at PPFAS Limited. He started his career in the same organization as part of his internship during his MBA. Ronak holds an MMS Finance degree from the University of Mumbai. Over to you, Ronak. Just one quick announcement. At the end of the presentation, we'll do Q&A through Slido. So this is the URL for the Slido app. You can just simply go to your browser and type sli.do/Ronak, and you can type in your questions there. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Is everybody able to hear me? Yes. Of course, it's tough to ask that. Somebody in the back will never know what I'm saying. So, can you hear me, guys? Yes. Cool. Yes. So today's topic is a little abstract. Initially when you're learning about investing, you read up on all these famous investors, how they think about investing, how they allocate money. Not too many people talk about this particular concept. So what do we know so far is that any good investor, if you have read his interview, biography, whatever, they will talk about conviction in one way or the other. They say that at certain points in time, they thought that this was a really great idea to invest in, and they put in a lot of money, took a lot of disproportionate risk, sometimes extreme concentration, sometimes one sector became a dominant part of their portfolio. And they are talking about conviction in various forms. They are not actually saying it in a very clearly defined way. But you need some degree of overconfidence, like you mentioned, in order to hold on to your idea. So, for example, you buy something and it falls 30% in the stock market, again, which is very different from what the earlier speaker talked about. He talked about unlisted private equity VC kind of a situation where exits are not very obvious or apparent also to get, and only valuation that you see is what other investors are willing to pay in the private market scenario. But in public equity, every 5 days a week you wake up, you get a quote of the business that you own. And it's very hard to then tell yourself that, okay, I thought of something as valuable yesterday is now 30% less valuable. Am I an idiot, or is the market getting something wrong? So you need to have certain degree of overconfidence in order to hold on to that idea. But again, this kind of conviction also dictates our portfolio allocation style. Some people have high conviction in 2-3 ideas, they will build a portfolio on 3 ideas. Some people say, I don't have conviction on 3 ideas, but I know 25 ideas that can do well, hopefully, and I will build a portfolio on 25 ideas. So conviction is a part of our basic portfolio management strategy by any investor, maybe a retail investor with a personal money to manage or a financial institutional investor. So I'm just going to ask questions because I don't want to keep talking. It's a long presentation depending on how we interact. So what do you think is conviction? I just want a few responses from you guys. What according to you is conviction? From an investing context or general also, if you want to add something to that point. Sorry? Confidence?
Look at it from a probability point of view. Like you know that there is upside and downside, but
right.
You know that the probability of getting to your full case scenario or
okay.
that is high.
So high probability of something working out. Okay. Anything else?
I'll make money out of this medicine.
Okay.
Deep commitment.
Deep commitment.
Strong belief.
Strong belief.
Pinpoint reasons for entry and exit.
Okay. So before I go further, how many of you are in investment management roles or analysts, or you manage your own money through equities? And the rest of you don't do that, obviously, but it's an amazing mix because there are 25% people in the audience who are like serious hard-nosed investors, and some of you are not. So my wife is not. So I asked her when I was going through the slides, what do you think is conviction according to you? And I described the presentation to her, and she came up with a very interesting definition. She says that conviction sounds a lot like love. And I sat down for a while and I said, okay, let me think about this. It is a very unique perspective. I had not thought about this. Is really conviction like love? And then I went back and thought, oh, it's not possible because I love my wife, but I can't tell her that I love her 20% for her looks, 30% for her intelligence. I cannot do metrics based on love. So I saved myself from that and said conviction is not like love.
And love is blind.
Yes. Another point to say that conviction is not like love. So although it seems like, so for example, how do you decide you want to be with a partner? It's a confidence that you have from inside that, okay, I feel like I want to be with this person. And for whatever reasons, it might be a blind faith in something, some idea, or you just genuinely feel for that person. Actually, conviction cannot be defined in such esoteric and subjective ways because ultimately we want to invest money in objective form. So because of a lack of definition from an investment context, I said, why not make my own definition? I mean, there is no rule against it. So I said, okay, conviction according to me is a mental state that allows us to take calculated risks. Now, each word is important according to me. So a mental state is where you are willing to suspend a lot of disbelief about certain ideas and okay, I want to believe that this is the scenario which is going to play out and am I able to take a calculated risk based on that scenario? That am I willing to measure that this is my risk appetite, this is the probability of success, this is the amount of capital I want to invest, and this is the amount of capital which the idea will absorb. So from an investing context, I think this definition for me makes sense, but you might also define it in your own way. And from all the investors that I've read about so far, investors I've admired and I've spoken to personally, I think a lot of people end up saying this, that process is better than the outcome in terms of measuring how an investment career is. But unfortunately, as public investors or even personally, if you look at our portfolio, the performance is what matters. We look at the outcome and decide if the process is good or not. You know, because sometimes we see that, okay, this guy has a fantastic process but does not generate great returns. But is he a good investor or not? We don't know. But somebody who has demonstrated phenomenal amounts of returns but may have a very haphazard or difficult to understand process. So that I always found as a big challenge, a dissonance in my mind, whether should I attribute it to the process or should I say the outcome comes first? And it generally becomes a black box from understanding that process making point of view. So of course, I mean, everybody in the audience I hope knows who the gentleman in the photo is. No need to introduce him. So like you or many people I know or even me, whenever that Berkshire shareholder letter comes out every year, it's like a ritual. You block time for it, you download the PDF file, you print it out, then you sit with a marker and you annotate all the important stuff that the person has said and you share it with everybody. So sometimes at the peak of Buffett shareholder letters, I got 40 letters with different annotations from different people in the network that we operate in. And it's interesting to see that how different people highlighted different lines. And what I found more interesting is that 40 people were willing to commit so much time to annotate everything and send it across. But how many people actually know how Buffett really thinks about investing? Okay, he wrote about something in some way and his career spanned across a different era which we don't operate in. And a lot of people have this ambition that, okay, if Warren Buffett can do it over a long period of time, everybody else can also generate returns over a long period of time. And sometimes that assumption may or may not work out, I don't know. But interesting thing is, the shareholder letter of Buffett is only one aspect of Buffett which he wants us to see. Interestingly, I picked up this book called Snowball. It's a very fat book, probably, so this is one palm of my hand and this is another palm of my hand. It might probably be that fat in terms of size. The first time I saw that book, I said, I have already read so much about Buffett. What will this one book give me as an insight about understanding Buffett? So, but I still started it because it was written by somebody dedicated to Warren Buffett. And it's okay, I'll just read the book. And about 20% of the way of reading that book, it starts with Buffett's childhood, like how his schooling was, how his family was, how his sisters and mother and everybody was. I said, this is not teaching me anything about investing. I mean, okay, yes, I understand what Buffett's family history is, it's good to know, but how do I know how it has helped Buffett invest in any way? So I dropped the book. And a friend of mine was a very senior investor. I told him this situation that, I started this book, but I had to drop it because it was too personal. I didn't want to know too many personal things about Warren Buffett. I'm okay reading his shareholder letters and getting his idea of how he thinks about investing. So he says, do yourself a favor, pick the book up again, start from page 1 and read it cover to cover without reading anything else in between. Just read that one book for a while. Let it take how much time you require. And so, okay, if this guy is saying it, I did it. And after I read, I realized that the investor Warren Buffett and the person Warren Buffett are part of the same person. So these are not two different personalities. So how we behave in our personal lives, how our daily habits shape us, actually make us the investors that we are. We tend to ignore that because we don't see it very obviously. Until somebody else points out that, okay, your arguments are based on this particular way you behave every day, then you might be able to think that, okay, I will take a step back and think what my behavior is. And I will tell you a reason how to, I'll tell you a technique of how to mitigate this, how to know what our process is. So reading Snowball was very revealing that each investor has their own personal background, their own personal way of looking at things, and their life experience influences the way they think about investing and what conviction they might have in owning those stocks. So firstly, stop copying people. You copy yourself if you can understand yourself and figure out what is working for you and what is not working for you. Because ultimately, no matter what Buffett does, no matter what we do, it's still a black box. We still don't know how the actual process works as to why we thought about a certain idea, how we came across a certain idea. We might want to formalize it in many ways. We might create objective, rule-based investing in some ways, but sometimes we don't know why things have happened. So, I don't know how many of you have gone to a therapist ever, but the process that a way therapist approaches any problem is that they're not there to provide a solution to you. They are there to make you realize what the solution is based on your personality. And they will ask you certain questions, they will guide you through a certain narrative of thought process and try and get you to speak more about what you're thinking and what you're feeling. And based on that, you reveal your own personality to yourself. That I don't think has been covered anywhere in investing to some extent. The only place where I saw it formally being described is the show called Billions, where there is that Wendy Rhodes, who is a psychologist which is stationed in-house in the fund, and she does psychological profiles of all the traders and investors and fund managers in that. That's a fantastic process, but I wish there was something for every investor. Maybe anybody in the audience would like to make an app for that. I wouldn't invest in it, but I'll use it. So this is a very age-old framework. I just thought, okay, can we systematize this understanding? And this presentation is mostly made for me. I am the audience for the presentation, and I thought I will share it so that I'll get more ideas to put more slides in. And there are multiple versions of this over the past, and I've added new things as I've kept on learning. So I hope this is not the final presentation. But the idea is that there are three ways that we can build conviction. One is to have an information edge, the second is to have analytical edge, and the third is to have a behavioral edge. And we will go through this. And the reason why we put all this effort is to go from point A to point B in the shortest possible time. So we are slaves to time value of money. We want to know that kitne jaldi paise kama sakte, you know, how fast this stock will go up, how my portfolio will grow the fastest over a period of time. But in real life, the road is far more interesting. It is not a straight path, and we don't know how which turns will occur and how it will change our investment thinking. So we'll start with the first pillar, the information edge. And before that, anybody has any questions, please interrupt. I don't mind. The more interactive this is, the less boring it will become. How many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? That's it? The Matrix. Okay. Since many of you have not seen, but I still want to not waste the reference. So in The Matrix, there's a character called Neo who sees things before they happen in a certain context. Now I've given a spoiler to the first movie. Doesn't matter. You can watch it anyway. So a lot of times, information edge is construed to be that way, that we see certain things before they actually happen. That gives us the information advantage to act before everybody else acts. But in reality, information edge has a very negative connotation. A lot of people, at least in public investing, so the previous gentleman, Vipin, was talking about private equity investing, VC investing, where information has certain value and does get traded very often. But in public equity investing, you have to be very careful as to, are you trading on material non-public information, or is this information part of a broader understanding of a particular company or a particular subject or a sector? So I'm not going to advocate insider trading. Please don't do that. The reason I say that is insider trading is the stupidest way to use information edge. A lot of people confuse information edge and insider trading. Insider trading is a very small and bad outcome of the process of information building. But actually, building information is quite easy in terms of, not easy, I would say simple, but it takes a lot of time to build, and we'll see how to build that information edge. So when I first started looking at companies and balance sheets, annual reports, A lot of times so you must have heard of the term called availability bias. The information that is available to you, you think that information is very relevant, and that is it sometimes. So a lot of times we look at information, and nowadays, I don't know about you guys, but my email has 11,100 messages. My WhatsApp is overflowing all the time. My reading list keeps on growing day after day. I have practically less time to read than actually to think. So in this kind of a situation, we are drowning in information, drowning in data. Are we really doing justice to the idea of learning something properly or not? So I think the true ignorance, like Karl Popper says, is not the absence of knowledge. There is knowledge all around us. It's only the failure to acquire it in certain context. So although he announced me that I did my MMS, but all my management education has come from Dilbert. And I like Dilbert because they take very esoteric and difficult to understand concepts and put it in a very simple, funny comic strip. So I think the laziness is far more important source of ignorance than anything else. And I'm going to walk you through some different stages of laziness which I have observed in myself over a period of time, and I tried to correct it. But like Ashok, the intern, says that how to make money by doing stock research. And the guy says, why does nobody do that? Is because they think that they probably might be lazy, so they just don't do it. Otherwise, it's very easy. You just do research and you make money in stocks. So the process of documenting myself has led me to some revelations about how I think about investments. And I found out that I have these 3 stages of laziness in me. I'll walk you through. This is not some great management theory. This is a very basic, biased view of my way of thinking. And I hope that some of you also must have gone through this. So the first stage of laziness, according to me, is I have heard enough. So we all seek out more experienced senior investors, and we talk to them about investment ideas. And sometimes it does happen that generously they will spend time with you, and they will tell you about a company or an investment idea in such a vivid detail. They'll articulate the idea in such a way, they will give you the entire scenario, how it should play out, what are the opportunity size, how will the company grow, how is the promoter doing, what is the valuation. They will explain the idea to you because they are generous, they want you to learn. And the moment you see that, okay, this guy has spent probably 40 years investing, and he comes up with this opinion about this particular business, of course he must have done his homework. So do I need to second guess this person who I respect as an investor or admire as an investor? Or do I just do my own homework again? In many cases, because of the respect for the person, you say, okay, I've heard enough. I think this is a good idea. Let's buy some shares. Let's figure out. Let's invest first, investigate later. The second stage of laziness, which I have found out is, I may have heard some investors speak and describe the idea to me. And I have then said, okay, maybe age has caught up with this person. I really want to put some effort in understanding what he's trying to say or she's trying to say. Then I go back to my desk and I open 2-3 years of annual reports, read some magazine articles, do some Google search, spend half an hour, 45 minutes, and convince myself that I've done some sort of research, one layer above the previous layer. Ideally, it's not. It's the same thing. We're just deluding ourselves that we have done some work or put some effort. So that is one way. The third is the exact opposite spectrum of this. I have read too much. So somebody gives me an idea. I outright reject the idea because so what this person thinks. So when I see this rating 7.1, how many people I know have seen the entire movie, right, from the first scene to the last scene, and then they're putting that rating over there. Some people may have seen the trailer and they liked the trailer and said, okay, it looks like a 7 movie, let's put a 7. Some people saw half the movie and said, isme gana hi nahi hai yaar. So probably it's a 3 according to them. That's why the average is 7, otherwise it would have gone much higher. But majority people thought that this company or this movie is a good idea to watch or spend time on. The problem is this is an opinion poll thinking where we are trying to gauge other people's views and other people's ability to understand those views to dictate our conviction. That's why the slide before this says that can we really borrow conviction? In fact, sometimes I think borrowing conviction is far worse than borrowing money to invest in stocks, because you actually don't know how much money to put in that idea, and what if the idea you invested in falls or goes up? You don't know, do you have to scale up, do you have to sell the position? You have no idea what to do because you haven't invested the time and the thought process to realize where it fits in your context of investing. So yeah, it's good to talk to people and understand their point of views, but you need to learn to apply a filter of objective understanding. That person's confirmation bias, availability bias are also playing when they are discussing ideas with us. And the same when we discuss ideas with other people. So we may think that we are extremely unbiased and the entire world is biased. That's not true. We are actually also equally biased. So even when we discuss ideas with people, do put a disclaimer in the beginning that this idea is completely biased, and then start any conversation. And that leads to the three most dangerous words in the investing industry, is to think for yourself. A lot of people say that, okay, you should think about the idea for yourself. You should make sure that other people's opinions don't really bias you. But that doesn't really happen. There are so many stimulants out there where they will keep on triggering a certain direction. So if you open the newspaper, so you turn on financial media, you will see all these things triggering you to a certain thought process. When everybody talks about a slowdown, you will see headlines about slowdown, people talking about gloomy scenarios, portfolios down 30-40%. People are saying that, "Arey, kuch nahi hone wala hai, this story is gone." So all sorts of things keep playing on our minds, and we have no idea how it affects the way we process information in that light. So I think for yourself is extremely good as a philosophy or a hypothesis, but actually think for yourself never happens because we're all influenced by our stimulus and surroundings. So there is one person I truly admire in this regard. I don't know how many of you are fans of Sherlock, but Sherlock Holmes in one of his books is a dialogue saying that it is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. And okay, valid question is that data is not always available to us, but there is some data available to us. Like the gentleman was saying that there is always information out there. We don't know how much is enough, but have we even gone across the entire information that we have in front of us to build that data in our mind and then create a theory out of that data? So you have seen industry trend over the past 10 years, and then you can probably come up with a theory that, okay, this trend is the growing trend or a slowing down trend or a flat trend. If you assume that one company in the industry has grown so that the industry's trend will be a growth trend, that may not be the right way to approach this. This is a very oversimplified example, but I'm pretty sure we are also tempted to react without data in many cases where we see a small size of data and then we try to extrapolate it over a long period of time. And that's what happens when you get influenced by outside stimulus. So how to conquer this? I mean, it's not easy, but there are tools available. So these two books I found ridiculously useful, and I don't use adverbs very lightly, but the first book, which is Best Practices for Equity Analysts, is so if somebody says do a time and motion study of a equity analyst, say camera is placed on top and see what this person does in two contexts, buy side and sell side, and try and understand what this person does on a day-to-day basis to come up with the investment ideas or to understand truly how to track a company or analyze a company. This book gives you a good framework. It may not be all-encompassing framework. There will be some things which are too excessive for us or other people, but you pick what you find useful from this and try to build a robust process of how to at least have that basic hygiene of looking at companies or doing equity research. And the second book, I cannot say this with any more emphasis, but you have to read this book. And probably as you grow as an investor, read it 2-3 more times as you spend some years investing, because you understand that what you thought was an important data point to collect was actually not a very relevant data point to collect. And some other data point which you thought was not so relevant, it should have been given more weightage. And also with different companies, different industries, what information we collect is actually biased based on that sector's trajectory of growth. So the investment checklist gives you the ability to put up in-depth research about companies with a very simple checklist. So there are extremely, I think 250-300 questions which are extremely comprehensive and open-ended. So these are not questions where you get definite answers. You might actually, one question might actually take you a month to even research. But it is useful to understand that there is a toolkit available out there which you can rely upon to some extent to build some of your understanding. And what tools you use beyond that to achieve the checklist is up to you. As each individual investor will have their own process. Some people might have a physical network of people, some people might use data analytics and all sorts of things. So that is totally up to us. But the tools are available out there, and this will mitigate some of those issues where we think that we are borrowing conviction from the environment. So far, you guys are extremely quiet. Any questions you might have, please keep it interactive, otherwise we're not off.
Give some examples of checklist items that we are not really, they're not obvious or something which we should have thought of because you've read the book and we haven't.
So checklist again is a very contextual thing to use. So for example, the basic checklist, a global checklist for starting a portfolio for us is, do we understand the people or do we admire the people who run this business? Like, are they shareholder friendly? So we use that as a part of our understanding to build a qualitative idea about the promoters, the management of the company. And that can have various aspects. There you physically network with the industry, talk to past employees, current employees, figure out different ways of doing things. Second is, do we understand this business correctly? I mean, what the financial numbers say and what our interpretation is. So in putting in the Excel sheet is very easy, but do you really understand what is the thing that moves this business? What are the triggers that actually affect the growth of this business or decline in the business over a period of time? So we try to understand that, try to gauge the profitability metrics and our ability to understand whether these metrics will continue or not. So these things are extremely contextual and should be done case by case. You cannot generalize them. And third is the price. Is this valuation right? So across a range of valuation parameters, do we think this is the right time to invest in this company? And we also look at contextually from the past valuations as to what they were. So when you look at these three broad, it's a checklist in the end. We are using this checklist to go through certain hygiene factors to know that this is what we need to know first. And now within that, when you deep dive into a company, so I'm not giving you examples because again, it's a very contextual answer to give. But generally, when we look at companies, there will be the financial shenanigans checklist and all kinds of checklists are available outside. And it's also part of this book. So it is not new understanding here. It's all compilation of understanding from different sources to build a more comprehensive checklist.
Any particular weightage they give out to certain questions that you want to?
That is up to you as an investor, what you want to weigh.
They don't suggest anything.
He does suggest, but I don't think that suggestion should be taken at face value. You need to understand why the suggestion is made and does it make sense from your investing point of view. So I have seen people who are technical traders who sometimes know better fundamental analysis of the company than the fundamental analysts also, because they want to know this particular trigger in the news which is affecting the fundamentals, which will affect the price eventually. And sometimes I am in awe that why did you spend so much time in understanding the fundamental thing, because your investment horizon is probably a week. And I think that is a unique perspective for me, but most people don't do that. So people have their own ways of investing which dictate what they think is more important. And I think experience will teach you that sometimes looking at one parameter more often might actually give you a better insight. And the company also keeps evolving. So you look at the company also as an unfolding movie, like Professor Bakshi says, and not like a still photograph. Yeah.
What do you think of tracking positions? Is it just a retail investor concept, or do we have it in the institution as well?
Of course.
Just to
Yeah.
get yourself interested in the idea, and then if it checks some of the boxes in your initial checklist, you invest some amount and then like an extensive research on that particular business, and then you start taking big positions.
Before you answer, sorry, I know that Slido was there. I'll probably go back to that after this question. Sorry. We are collecting questions for the end, so please do keep putting questions there.
I also wanted to add one question that we are talking about digging more and more to get conviction, but it so usually happens, definitely happens with me, is that the more I dig, the less I know,
Yes.
and you lead to a analysis paralysis. I want to know what do you do to avoid that?
So there are a few slides coming ahead which talk about this concept, which also I have wanted to defer his answer also. So tracking position is a concept which everybody has to follow, because you may have an investment universe out of which only 20 companies are investable today, but rest of them you want to know about. It's not like these 20 companies will last to eternity in your portfolio. Some will have to be sold, some will not perform, some will have to be churned over a period of time. So you need to keep tracking. How you track is up to you. Some people buy a small quantity and they track. Some people maintain a mental checklist and say, "Ye companies I want to track, and I will keep tracking their performance metrics over a period of time." So it's a common concept and it should be practiced, because there are many ideas.
Funds, do you commit money to that?
Sorry? No, we cannot commit money because then your portfolio dilutes. You need to invest in 25 or 30 max ideas which you want to build a portfolio with. Those are your main ideas, out of which there may be some 200 more ideas which you want to understand better or are not investable at this price point, so you keep tracking them. We'll go to Slido after this, so I will not take questions in between. If you really have to ask a question, do flap your hand. So I didn't mention about triggers earlier, but really understanding of triggers is something a little nuanced. There is no scientific method of saying that this trigger will work in a certain business and then the profitability will change, or the company's market share can change, or something will happen. But as an investor, we do need to understand the triggers of what will make the business perform better and also what will make the stock perform better over a period of time. And tweeting about your stock positions is not a trigger, by the way. So don't consider it as a trigger. It's an artificial trigger. It's market manipulation. Don't do it. The point is, can we truly understand the growth or direction of the cash flows of the company or the earnings of this company and what will trigger that growth is what I'm trying to come at, without sacrificing the core business attractiveness. So to conclude the idea of building the information edge, I would say two basic things is to network with the real world and sincerely hope. I'm using the word hope here, not lightly, but genuinely using the word hope, that you can build good insights over a period of time. So you can keep playing gully cricket and imagine that you are Virat Kohli, but actually if you train yourself like Virat Kohli, only then you will become Virat Kohli. So can you really build a process where you can capture information, analyze it properly, which is the next part of the presentation. And can you hope that these insights are actually useful over a long period of time? We don't know. A lot of these things are post-fact. They happen, their importance is only apparent after they have happened or they helped us. So second part of the presentation, the second lens which I like to call it, is the analytical edge. So when you are in a situation where you are a institutional investor or even a retail investor, and you look at what kind of questions analysts ask in conference calls or analyst meets, and you see a lot of smart people there. It's people who have tremendous number of years of experience or even amazing educational qualifications. Very smart people, no disrespect to any of them. But most of these people, they know what the right answers are, but very few people actually know what to ask as a right question to the management in the company. I'll explain this to you. So what are the key things that will help a business grow or a stock price grow? You know, profitability and growing market share and competition not affecting you because you have a moat in some way. So these answers are known to everyone and all sorts of questions gravitate towards getting these answers. But the problem is these things don't fall from the air. I mean, all of these are daily struggles of the promoter and the management in order to achieve high profitability, in order to achieve a growing market share, in order to build that competitive advantage which other companies cannot take over a period of time. So these things are not very trivial and these questions don't get asked. So right question to ask a management is, how are you going to build this moat? A lot of things is, what is your moat is a very easy question to answer. Whatever answer you want to give and people will believe that is the answer. May not be the real answer, but how to build a moat is actually a better answer. How will you make sure that your key employees stay in the company over a long period of time? How do you think the profitability of this business should last in the next few years? A lot of these how questions don't come very often because most of these conversations are quite contextual and management access has improved so much for institutional investors that some of these questions are already answered in some of the analyst meetings. So it's very hard to actually find a public discussion of how a good business is and how the management actually thinks. So where at one point there were only 25-30 companies who used to publish transcripts, now there are 300-350 companies publish transcripts. Now imagine if you are a serious investor and you want to build your database of understanding and investment coverage universe is 200 stocks. Each quarter they will come up with a conference call transcript. So 200 into 4 every year you have to read, apart from your other reading of annual reports, books, watching Netflix, stuff like that. So I think knowing what questions to ask to a person in a certain context will actually be a better way of analyzing the situation or analyzing a business than to know the answer, because everybody knows the right answer. How many of you are Taken fans? The movie Taken, the Liam Neeson film series. I saw one hand go up immediately. Yeah, there's 2 and there's 3. So 3 of us are serious fans of Liam Neeson. The reason I put up Liam Neeson as an example, and I don't know, because this joke is going to dilute itself because nobody has seen the movie apart from 3 of us. But this is a guy who, in a situation, he hunts down bad guys with a vengeance. I mean, he hunts down with a passion. And Taken 1, 2, 3, 4, all 4 movies, the plot is the same. The situation changes, but the plot is the same essentially, that he has to go and hunt bad guys down all across the world. And some context has happened, that somebody is kidnapped, some wife is missing, daughter is kidnapped, friend is missing, whatever. The point is, like investors, we are like Liam Neeson in some way because we try to derive intellectual satisfaction through the process of investing. And don't get me wrong, there is plenty of room for doing that. But a lot of times we don't have to. Some things are just simple. You don't need to intellectualize everything in order to understand any situation better. I'll give an example because just before Vipin said, in private equity context, the private investors are actually working with the management on a day-to-day basis. They will track metrics which will not be available to us as outside public investors. So we only get the quarterly statements or the presentation that the management puts out. But when these VC and private equity investors will actually get a different kind of metrics, far more detailed metrics of the business than an outside investor can get. And that is also necessarily because of the way the deals are structured. In public equity investing, it will be material non-public information to disclose. And if it is disclosed to everyone at the same time, then competitive edge is gone. So in that context, we do have a ability to work with the management and intellectualize the process of actually seeing how the business can be grown. But in public equity investing, the ability to do that is quite limited. You cannot do it at the same scale as the private equity investor can do. So sometimes we may corner ourselves into very complex businesses. Like there's a rage about specialty chemicals business, and can we, which is the next best specialty chemicals company to invest in? This is the kind of blog posts I read a few months back. And I always wonder that how many, so maybe that person has put in the effort, but when I read the document, I saw that supply chain risks are not mentioned. How does this particular product stay relevant over a period of time? There's so many questions that keep coming up about how that business is relevant or not. I realize that a lot of times we go into complex areas to create satisfaction that, okay, we have put some effort, we have racked our brains, we have tried to figure something out, and because of that, the returns will come eventually. So for that, I have a very simple solution for myself at least. I have made this mental box called too difficult box. And the reason I made this box is, a lot of times we may understand the business, and it is a very rewarding process to understand a complex business model, to understand several linkages. Because all companies in the world eventually are linked in some way or the other. We don't know how sometimes, because we have not seen the entire supply chain, but there will be some linkages somewhere in terms of financial terms, technological terms, or raw material or supply side, vendor side terms. But in many cases, we don't know what downside is in that business. Like you may understand how the business operates, but we don't know what are the few things that will actually fail this business. Sometimes those things are completely invisible to us. So sometimes complex businesses should be complex for a reason, and in my view, should be put in this too difficult to understand box, because we don't know how the business can fail in a really meaningful way. What I've noticed with also, after a few years of experience, so the kind of analysis I used to do when I was very young and in the first 2-3 years of my work, and the kind of analysis I do now, of course, it will have a bias towards the way I think of investing, but power to visualize outcomes is something which will only happen when you have seen a lot of outcomes play over. So you keep turning over rocks, you keep understanding different businesses, build those cases of how businesses have performed in certain situations and market cycles, and that's how you are able to visualize. To give you a context of how this works is, do a thought experiment. Take one blank Excel sheet, and I will tell you that this is a business ABC. You have to project what this business will do in the next 5 years. You have nothing given to you. You have to start from scratch and put in some scenario that is this going to be a pessimistic, optimistic, or flat scenario. In the second example, I would give you a spreadsheet filled with 20 years of financial statements of the company, mapped to each schedules and everything, like income statement, cash flow, balance sheet, everything is all pre-fed in that Excel sheet. And then I ask you the same question, that please give me an assumption or prediction of what this business will do in the next 5 years. Now, honestly, answer it to yourself. But when I did it to myself, I realized that when the entire Excel sheet was blank, my imagination ran wild. I went into all directions and tried to understand, okay, will this affect the business? Will that affect the business? The moment I was constrained in the financial statements provided to me in the second example, I just dragged the growth rate for the next 5 years and said, okay, this is maybe if I growth rate is 20% above this is optimistic, 20% below this is pessimistic. I got an answer, but that does not mean the answer is right or is relevant also. A lot of times analysis goes into the direction where we try to extrapolate things that have already happened, but in many cases things don't happen that way. We don't know why, but the power to visualize that is only going to come when you deal with different situations. I've seen case studies where you know that in this scenario this promoter behaved in a certain way that may not actually happen because the business was of X size at that time. Now the business has grown. So what do you do? And to illustrate this, I don't need to even talk about this. So I am sure everybody in the audience has heard of Professor Ashwath Damodaran of New York University. And he has a fantastic blog. If you haven't read that blog, please do read that blog. And before reading that blog, do read this book, because see, he's a very numbers oriented guy. He takes a business case study and does detailed DCF analysis of all the companies that he does. The most interesting part he does is, as the business information comes up, so for example, he will look at a business say 5 years ago, Then 3 years after looking at that business and building that model, he will again take a look at that business and incorporate the new understanding or new learnings of what developments had happened in that business and the sector to change the valuation metrics in the DCF model, the assumptions that he has made in the DCF model. And I like that process a lot. It is extremely intellectually satisfying, one thing. And second thing is it gives you a discipline of looking at information, updating your point of view. Otherwise, you will see that, okay, this has happened, but this should have happened. And you ignore that as a valuation parameter. So, being a numbers driven guy, he talks about a situation where he always used to get typecasted in that numbers thinking while investing and never went beyond the point where companies were available at decent valuations, but because he could not imagine or visualize how the business should be, or he did not want to give too much of a credit to the business in growing, he said he ignored the narrative completely. And there are some investors on the other side who are too narrative driven. So they will put a story out in front of us and they will say this story will play out in this way, this is going to be a $5 trillion economy, then trickle down effect of that will be so and so, this sector will be 10x of it is right now in 5 years. So narratives can also sometimes drive your thinking, but then you need to marry that with numbers to some context. So each investor will have their own level of adjusting to how far in the narrative they want to go or how far in the numbers they want to go. Of course, being at each spectrum does not help you, but some people are numbers oriented, some people are stories oriented. So you need to find that balance yourself, and this book does an amazing justice to that concept. And the reason I say it is, somebody in the audience asked me before that, do you prefer smaller companies to larger companies in terms of growth potential? I will answer this question differently. When a company is small, the promoter is extremely hands-on, the management is accessible, you can approach them, ask them very specific questions about the business and what has happened in the past, and you will get a specific answer to it because it's not a very complex business. Supply chain is not very difficult to understand for that business. But the moment you add scale to that equation, all these things change. The reliance on your vendors, the reliance on financing, the reliance on having a middle management layer, reliance on having strong HR processes, all those things which are extremely invisible from the outside or in the annual report are not apparent, they come into play. So how you look at a business at a certain size totally changes when the business is much larger and a more complex machine. So complexity increases your ability to understand the business also. But again, this is what I meant by power to visualize. If you go into narrative zone, you might actually presume that, okay, what this company could do at 100 crore revenue, they will be able to do easily at 10,000 crore revenue. May not be possible because you will have to build so many processes in between in order to reach to that 10,000 crore destination. So analysis is a very important part, is to imagine the outcomes and figure out what has played in the past. How have other companies in the industry scaled? What is the largest company in the industry doing? What is the smallest company doing? And is there a chance that these companies can, at some point, grow to that level? So like I learned a lot from reading Dilbert, some of my education also has come from reading Calvin and Hobbes comic strips. And this is the most important point probably in the entire presentation for me, is about confirmation bias. And this is how confirmation bias works. So Calvin's dad is a Lukha person, he doesn't like to address too many complicated questions. So Calvin keeps on nudging him with very simple but very intriguing questions. So he asks in this case, Dad, what causes wind? So dad doesn't want to answer obviously. He says, tree sneezing. So Calvin is really intrigued, really? So his father says no, but the real answer is complicated. But Calvin has satisfied himself and he goes out and it's windy and he says, oh, the trees are really sneezing today. And this is a very common thing that happens. And I will tell you why this happens. So there is a very interesting book called Alchemy, which came a few months back, written by the head of Ogilvy and Mather, the ad agency, Rory Sutherland. If you haven't heard of this guy, Google him, watch his YouTube videos, extremely entertaining communicator. What he says in this book, and there are many important ideas in that book also, but one important idea which I thought from a confirmation bias point of view is that we stop looking for better answers when our brain is provided with a logical reason for something that has happened. Now, people can gain that ability. If you ask a management of a company why so and so thing happened, and you got a very logical answer, and you may satisfy yourself because many people are saying the same answer to you. Now, is that the real answer or is it narrative that people are building and saying that thing because the real answer is so complicated that it cannot be given to you? For example, again, specialty chemicals. A lot of Indian companies were doing very well in the past and some are still doing well. Some of the answers were, oh, there is some problem in China, that's why capacity is coming to India, and that's why we are seeing good business. Well, maybe, that may be one part of the answer. But really, do you know that this is the real answer? Do we know the full extent of that answer? Maybe the real answer is 100 and we are only aware of 10 of that 100. So the point is, confirmation bias is extremely easy to get succumb to, because we suddenly say that, okay, I've got an answer which I think is logical and I think this should be the right answer, and you move on. You stop digging, and that is the most dangerous thing in analysis, because you require data for analysis. You will stop looking for data after that point. So I think confirmation bias can be killed if you have this framework in mind that, okay, all things are not visible and logical. Maybe there is something happening in the background which is worth finding out. I'm talking about these things in parallel processing, okay? So people in computing will understand parallel processing, but non-computing guys, you are looking at 10 companies at a time, and maybe there are 100 more companies you want to look at, and you have to keep this thought in your background that, okay, you may have only read so much and that is the only thing you know. And to come to your question now, that when do you say this information is enough? Actually, it is never enough. New information keeps being generated every day. Business cycles keep changing over a period of time. You need to keep incorporating that in thought process. And that's when I want to refer to Aswath Damodaran's idea that you update your model based on what information you have, what data you've collected. So I think the primary focus should be what data you want to collect. That for this particular business, this particular parameter is far more important than any other parameter. And once you know that in your mind, you codify it in your Excel sheet and say, okay, I will try this particular thing for this business and see if the correlation is strong or not. Then you have statistical analysis on top of that. Say, okay, this is a high correlation metric, we should keep tracking that. I think that is the worst case scenario you can have. I don't know if there are any better answers, and probably I will figure out in my experience as I go ahead. But I think to stop confirmation bias, all logical answers need not be the final answers. The process of analysis is actually quite amazing to see, which I think for any investor is a very visually important thing to understand. Because we also need to understand why some decisions were made at certain points in time based on what we knew at that time. So three things I think come out of this. One is experience really matters when you're looking at your own ideas from a historical context. You need to be prepared. And this is a very trivial thing to say, but actually, can you imagine a scenario where a portfolio goes down by half? Can you imagine a scenario where you put money in a stock and the stock goes to zero? I mean, it's as good as a crash, engines failing when you're taking off and losing thrust in the airplane. So what do you do in that situation? And the only way to approach it is not getting emotionally jittered, but have clinical calmness. You think of the situation at that particular point, you see what options you have at that particular point in time, and you act accordingly. Very easy to say all these things, but put yourself in the context of the pilot, the passengers, an investor who has lost half his money in a very short amount of time. All these things are real examples which actually happen to real people, and real people react to them in certain ways, which is how the market is, where people are reacting to their own way of looking at things. I think it's a Clint Eastwood movie, so I'm saying it is very well made, so please do watch it. Even if it doesn't have any Oscars to its name, doesn't matter. It's a really good movie to watch. And if you really want to understand, without watching the movie, what he's trying to do in the movie, another CFA Institute video which is there on YouTube is by Dr. Gerd Gigerenzer. He studies intuition and uncertainty. It's a very interesting topic of study, and he takes a different way of approaching that. So on one side we have seen Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky talk about behavioral finance and eliminating biases. He's on the other side, he's saying that these biases will help you think better. You need to sharpen your way of understanding how to use that bias for your advantage. And I'll come to that later. But this is basically that, the bias which was used by Sully in the movie, which is the spoiler, I don't want to reveal it, which helped him save so many lives. Not a single person died, by the way. It's an amazing, it's called a miracle on the Hudson. It's amazing. The probability of crash landings leading into, not crash landings, water landings leading to survival are much lower, but in this case nobody died. So again, watch this video. It's freely available, right? It's on YouTube.
Society YouTube channel.
Right. I really admire CFA Institute because they get all sorts of amazing speakers and bring them together in contexts where we otherwise wouldn't have read. So after watching that video, I went back to my library and I saw that this book was already on my shelf called Gut Feelings, but I never picked it up because behavioral finance malum hai. But actually no, I didn't know a lot of things. So he wrote a very nice book called Gut Feelings, which talks about how intuition works. So for example, the cover of this book shows that we may want to avoid going into a dark alley because it's scary, anything can happen. People can jump at you, you can get mugged in the dark alley, but actually nothing might be there, so we don't know. So a lot of these biases do really help us sometimes make decisions and take precautions, which we otherwise wouldn't have justified. I'll give you a very simpler way to understand that. So when you throw a ball at a dog, how many of you played with a dog ever? A stick or a ball? Okay, few people. But you've seen other people do it. And when you throw a ball at a dog, the dog catches it every single time. Okay, every single time. And which is amazing. We don't think about that, but it's amazing. But it's actually amazing. Every single time. How does the dog know where the ball is going to land? Every single time and catch it. We can justify human being do it because human beings have calculative ways. But dog is a dog. Dog will not calculate, right? This is the actual formula of a projectile motion equation, where you know the velocity, the angle, the parabolic curve and everything. All these things matter in terms of where the ball will land. This is how you calculate. But a dog will not go to a blackboard when you throw the ball and do the math and then come back and say, okay, now the ball is going to land here and I will go there now. So Gerd talks about this in a very amazing way. Dr. Gerd says, we use something called as a gaze heuristic. Now imagine you're playing cricket and there's a ball you have to catch. Now, I have never done it myself, but I don't know about you guys, but I've never put a formula, put a calculator and say, okay, now the ball is coming down, let me calculate everything and I will go to that location where the ball will come based on this formula. It might be accurate, but by the time the match will be over. So, the gaze heuristic says that you look at the ball, you maintain the angle of the gaze of that ball and you run towards the ball in general direction. And that's why you see a lot of times fielders bang on each other sometimes because they're looking at the ball and not at each other. So, and they also catch the ball. Again, amazingly, the small tiny target coming out from the sky and you are able to catch it. The point is, sometimes you use heuristics, you use simple techniques to reach the final outcome. You need not want to intellectualize everything, you do not want to overanalyze everything to answer your question about analysis paralysis. Sometimes the answer is simple. You don't have to extend your mind too much. Try and put it into a framework where it has worked in the past and will it work again? If it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. The point is that there are simple answers out there which we haven't figured out yet, or we haven't honed our ability to take advantage. For example, what is risk appetite? That is a question people ask every time, and there are of course financial scales available to measure risk appetite to some extent. And you can put that formula and see, okay, this person can invest more in equity because equity is more risky and he can take more risk based on capital earning potential. But again, maybe that person does not have the temperament to sit through a drawdown of 20-30%. No matter how young the person is, no matter how much capital the person will build over a period of time through salary or other means, maybe temperament is not there. It's a simple thing. So then the advisor's role is to probably figure out what will work for this particular situation rather than giving you general gyan of finance, no, you should do this, you should do that. The point is, use a heuristic at that time that, okay, this person is afraid. He will be driven by fear rather than logic. So use that to help him guide and discipline his investing process to some way. So the idea is less is more. So do watch all those things. Do read that book also, Gut Feeling. It's a very easy to read book. The research papers that he puts out are extremely difficult to understand, but he has simplified all of these things into those books for a lay person to understand. Another book he wrote for financial people because he thought that gut feeling was too behavioral and psychological. This is called Risk Savvy. Some of the same concepts are mentioned in this book also. But in conviction, no matter how well behaved or how much biases we want to eliminate or want to hone them properly, this is the paradox of conviction. And last year when I was here for the Value Investing Pioneer Summit, Samir Arora was presenting and he mentioned a very interesting line in his presentation. He says that conviction is higher in the paths we choose not to follow. So, let it sink. So when I heard it for the first time, I also wrote it down in my note and then I went back home and while reading those notes, reflecting on them, I said, what is this line? This is very interesting. So he says conviction is higher in paths we choose not to follow. So there are 25 or 20 ideas in the portfolio that we have and there are hundreds of ideas we did not invest in. And we had genuine reasons probably to not invest in those ideas. So it's a binary choice whether you invest in the idea or not invest in the idea. But we chose to not invest in the idea. And that is our conviction of why this idea will not work. And I have not been able to answer this question yet, but why do we have this conviction? It's a very important question to understand. And can we translate that conviction to a positive side? That, okay, if I am so convinced that this idea will not work, what is the opposite side of that? If you invert that, what is the way I can convince myself to invest in some idea? Again, a theoretical framework, but actually opens up our idea, opens our mind to think about something which is obvious in front of us that so for example, we think that I don't like the promoter quality of this company, so I will not invest in this particular company, which is a reasonable conviction to have. You may ignore each and every other metric of that business. The stock might double, triple, become a multi-bagger right in front of your eyes, but you may never want to invest in a company where you don't trust the person running the business, and which is your conviction. That's where the difference in investment processes comes in. So be cognizant of that and figure out on the other side how to build conviction on the ideas we do end up investing in. And there's a way to do that, okay? And I have quizzed so many investors, professional investors, senior investors, as to how many people actually follow this rule, like writing down your decision making at the time you're making the decision. And I have found shockingly that very few people actually do it in a meaningful way. I mean, they might scribble something that, okay, I have invested in so and so, or they might have the demat statement in front of them. The problem with that is, if you're not aware of why you have done all these things, or what you were thinking at a certain point in time, you will not have a context when you look back at post-mortem analysis of why this idea worked or did not work. So again, I will take you back to the therapist session where they try to investigate how you're thinking and feeling about things to make you act in a certain way because you want to change something in your life because of which you are there at that particular point in time. When you write things down, you can't escape any of those things. So they mention journaling as a concept for people who are undergoing therapy. So when you journal things down, when you write about your day-to-day things, that okay, I felt like this at this particular point in time. I did this at this particular point in time. At this particular time of day, my mood was so and so. This is a very simple process to do. Just take a small notebook and do it. Why can't we do it for an investing thing? So I read the annual report of this company. This is what I felt, and you put a date to it. Now, maybe 5 years down the line, when you are looking at this idea again and saying that, okay, what was I thinking 5 years ago when I did not invest in some idea or when I did invest in some idea? And now you go back to a journal and make it searchable so that you can find it afterwards also. You know exactly what you were thinking. You actually decode your own process. You can see your own evolution. So I started doing this 7 years ago, and now it's a huge library of notes that I have. And I can actually see in my past that I was so naive and was not asking some relevant questions at that time. Maybe 7 years hence I will think I was naive today. It's a different thing. But I will let that time decide at that time. But again, this is very important because you cannot escape your own decisions when they are written down in time and it's time stamped. So you can always go back to it and say, okay, I was thinking in this way. It's either right or it's wrong. Another aspect of behavioral edge is that knowing that sometimes things will take its own time. You may have a trajectory for a business. The expectation that business should do so and so in a certain amount of time actually won't happen based on your expectations. It will have its own trajectory, its own time. It will work on its own. We have zero control over how a company runs as an outside investor. And that's why just sometimes having patience is far more valuable. It's a heuristic. Don't do anything. If you're invested, sit tight. If you're not invested, ignore. Kya bolega? Another aspect of behavioral thinking, so one thing that Vipin mentioned was very interesting and which also should happen in public equity investing. So he's saying that any deal that happens, investment that happens, is actually two people sitting across each other, and you try to understand what that person's nature is, what that person is, what kind of a person that is. He gives us 4 frameworks for investors' point of view. He also said about how promoters or entrepreneurs think in a certain way. This is basically trying to create empathy about the person. What situation is that person in, and what is that person trying to achieve in that situation? Can we use this similar framework in public equity investing, where the promoter or management are extremely seasoned in talking to outside investors? They will give you exactly the right answers you want to hear. Even if the business is doing 10x capex, they will still say it's asset-light business. Because that's what you want to hear. They may say that, okay, iska ROE in 10 years will be 25%. Right now it's 5%. I mean, yeah, that's what I want to hear, but is it going to happen? I don't know. But what is leading that person to say all these things? So again, it goes back to the point I was mentioning where knowing what questions to ask to a person is actually empathy. You're actually trying to gauge what is more important for that person to know. Maybe the person has no interest in running the business. Ask him about his golfing game and see how he lights up. Probably that will give you an answer that this person is not focused on the business and maybe just wants to play golf. So there's a nice book about this called Against Empathy. It's a very controversial title, which actually made me pick up this book. And when I saw this book, I said, okay, let me see. I know what empathy stands for, but do I really understand how to use it in a thought process? So Paul Bloom is a psychologist from Yale. So he mentions, I just mentioned 2 points in this. He mentions there are 2 aspects of empathy. One is emotional empathy and second is cognitive empathy, technical terms. Emotional empathy means I feel exactly what you're feeling. Like if you stub your foot against a door, I know the pain that you're going through right now because I have also gone through that pain in the past. So I can relate. This is emotional empathy. I know exactly what your pain is. The cognitive empathy is what we actually require, which is in common terms called compassion. Like if the promoter is actually running a quarterly business where he wants to show quarterly growth to the analysts or wants to give projections to the analyst, we need to be empathetic with the fact that he is on a different mindset. We can't force him to think the way we want this business to grow because he's running the business and he wants to run it in the own way. All we can do is we can part from that conversation with a positive or negative attitude. We can say that, okay, if I am an investor which is momentum driven, I want this guy to keep saying all these things so that the stock momentum and business momentum continues. If I am a long-term oriented investor who doesn't care about momentum, but I want to buy something at a reasonable price, which is a good quality business, which is run with business principles in mind, I will not partner with this guy. Breaking our, sorry.
I think a movie reference for this would be Other People's Money.
Yes.
Right?
How many of us seen that? Other People's Money? 1, 2, 3 people have seen that movie. You need to watch movies, man. I mean, see, a lot of the things are better explained in literature, media, which we otherwise will not get a chance to think about in those contexts. So try and expand your vocabulary that way. So yeah, we will not understand other person's pain, but we can at least be compassionate. We can say, okay, this person is running the business in a particular way. I may or may not agree with that. If I agree, I will invest at a certain price. And despite all these things, we keep saying information nikalo, analyze karo, behave properly, control your emotions. But we tend to make mistakes despite that. So again, one of the sources of education is Tom and Jerry. So how many of us seen Tom and Jerry? Please. So yeah, I mean, it's when you see how blow-ups happen in Tom and Jerry universe, they come back to life and again start doing the same thing again. Try to avoid blowing up. The whole idea is mistakes will happen. You will end up not understanding some things at the right time you wanted to understand them. But don't lose all your money and go out of the game. That is just bad. There's a nice movie I watched, a documentary film I watched called General Magic. Now this is anybody has seen that movie? Very unlikely. So this is a recent documentary. It's about a company called General Magic, which was in the 90s, like the Apple of that time. Like, this is the next Apple. And they had the idea, so whatever modern day smartphones we use, they had that idea in the 1990s, the mid 1990s. The only problem is they were too early, of course, but the philosophy and principles in which they were thinking, creating the ecosystem, the cloud internet and all those things, they were in place at that time, which only after 15 years of that company's failure, we actually saw in the first product called the iPhone. So yeah, mistakes happen, but you have to understand them contextually. In that situation, the failure burnt out all the employees and the promoters. They never came out with any other venture afterwards. They all were defeated completely. But there are certain ways, because they put everything in that business. So they were financially ruined, emotionally ruined, personal relationships were severed. But some people came out of that. So the person who designed the iPod and the iPhone was the first employee of that company, Tony Fadell. The guy whose OS is used by 98% of the world, the Android OS, the creator is Andy Rubin, who again was one of the early employees of that company. So the ideas continued in different forms and contexts, but failure can actually defeat you in ways you may not understand. Leads to progress. So you might injure yourself or you might fail or make mistakes, but if you don't reflect on it, and how to reflect I just mentioned, you go back to your notes, see what you did, which was wrong. You need to reflect and understand what made you to take that decision at that particular time. Can you avoid it going ahead? So for behavioral edge, two things I would say are very important. Try and find your emotional control. There is no general answer for this. And just wait for it. Sometimes the idea will take its time. Sometimes you are too early. So it's okay. Sorry, I lied. Last 2 slides. I think it's very important to have heroes in your life. Some inspiration which is outside of your field of work. Because in your field of work, you have the context of that person, a legendary figure who is a great investor, you try to emulate, it doesn't matter. The point is, can you find heroes in day-to-day context and outside of your career or profession, which you can relate to and understand how to employ some of their processes. This guy over here runs a podcast called Hardcore History. His name is Dan Carlin. And he's not a historian. He's a radio show host, or was a radio show host. His ability, so there's a technique called historiography. So if you want to study history of any civilization or any particular culture, you read everything that is written about that particular culture by other cultures. who came in contact with that culture. It's called historiography. And based on that, you build this narrative of how this culture was and how this point in history happened. So he talks very long shows on World War I, II, the Mongols, and goes back to Persian kings, the entire Eastern to Western European history of what happened in the past 2000 years. And it's quite amazing if you're a history fan to go back to these processes and see that this guy, who is not a trained historian, yet has the ability to bring everything together, and his views match a lot with the historians or academic historians who have done the research in that field. So he's my hero in that regard, that if you actually go hunt for data, if you go hunt for a story and idea, you will find the information, you will find it some esoteric corner, but keep your mind open, keep your eyes open, and figure out what you're doing. And last slide, even though we put in all the effort and whatever processes that we follow, we might write down, we might employ robots, algo trading, whatever, we are not entitled to the returns of any of these ideas. This is not some jagir that we have to get as an inheritance from the promoter or something. We don't run these companies. We are just investors in these companies. We are tourists in a way, in the time frame context. The promoter family, the management put in their blood, sweat, hours, everything in the business to make that business success. We are participating in that particular point in time with these people's vision. So no entitlements, just do the work, and thank you. Ask me. I will answer the question. Should we decrease position on a stock when we make loss? That is, should we follow the herd? Extremely contextual question, not necessarily generalize it. Sometimes, so in what context would you sell a stock? I don't know who asked this question, so I'm just looking generally everywhere. You want to sell a stock when the idea has been proven wrong. That you came in the idea with a certain, you came into the stock with a certain idea that this is the outcome of the business that should happen. Unlock them. And the idea was wrong, your investment thesis was wrong. So that is an obvious sell. No matter if the price goes up or goes down, it should not matter. Second thing is, when the valuation has reached a level where it's not sustaining the business metrics. Now, for example, the business may have declined so much in terms of actual operating profits and cash flows that the valuation currently quoting is not suitable. So, okay, the price fell, but there's no reason to hold on to an overvalued stock in that context. And third, you know that the management is something you don't want to partner with. And you realize that, okay, these are the people I thought they were good at a certain point in time, but they may not be the way they were. So you jump out of that. So this is irrespective of the price. So I think instead of looking at the price as a trigger to enter or exit, price is one of the inputs. You have to understand in what context you look at the price. Can you value it accordingly, and then you make a decision. It's difficult to answer in a general way. So more conviction and depth of research works well when the bet on a company is right, but will be disastrous when the bet is wrong. Type 2 error, how to avoid. That is absolutely true. We may be also falsely convinced of an idea that is supposed to work in a certain way, and failures will happen. That's why we have concepts like portfolio allocation and diversification. We need to use those not because so a lot of times people say that you diversify because you don't know enough, which is true. You don't know enough because knowledge is never enough. You keep looking at stuff. But probably look at the promoter's point of view. The promoter's entire equity will be invested in one company. No matter how much side investments he will do, 90% will be invested in one company or one industry. So we are not a promoter. We are managing somebody else's money or our own money. And we have the luxury to buy or sell shares based on what we think the business prospects will be. So why straitjacket ourselves into concepts where the failure or type 2 error will kill us? Assume that the error will happen and design a portfolio in such a way that probably you will get less hurt if the error actually happens. That's my view again. People may have different views. Business reports and news in the media about the company you invested in, how to pick what to read and what to ignore. So extremely contextual. First of all, when you start a company or industry from scratch, you have no idea about that industry, you have to read everything that is out there and then learn over a period of time that this is more relevant, that is less relevant. That will come through experience. It cannot be taught. You cannot. So when I train interns, sometimes I watch the process of how they go through everything, and the kind of questions they ask tells me that are they in the right direction or not. So go to somebody who already knows about that industry in detail and probably see if your thought process is right, if you want to hijack it. Or you go the longer way, you basically read everything you can about it that is available and talk to everybody after you have built up your own mind, which are two different ways of approaching it. Again, having the strict discipline of reading something about the industry is very important. You cannot just invest first, investigate it. You can't do that beyond a certain point. And try to know what sort of sources of information are relevant. So you might be getting broker reports in your email, but may not be relevant every time to read all those reports. I mean, it's okay. You are getting information doesn't mean you have to absorb it every time. Is there any thumb rule at what level, say 10 to 20% drop, should we have a stop loss? It's an individual call. If you are comfortable 50% drawdown, put 50% stop loss. I don't know. It's a personal call. It's your trading strategy or investment strategy that will drive that call rather than me prescribing that this is what is supposed to be enough. Again, portfolio allocation will be a big part over here. If a 90% allocation falls 20%, you will lose a lot more wealth in absolute terms when a 10% position falls 20%. So, top down or bottom up or both? I do bottom up because I am that kind of an investor. Although but I look at macro trends also to understand what is happening broadly in the industry. So what we look at while investing is the listed space. The stocks are listed, but there are so many companies in the sector will be unlisted. To understand what is happening in those, you need to probably access some macro information to see what generally the industry is doing and what are the listed companies doing differently or not. So I think, so Seth Klarman has this quote that you invest bottom up, but you worry top down. So probably that helps to some people. I think that is a useful way of thinking about how to separate where to put the effort. Most of investment books have US-centric concepts and on US economy. Although investing cuts across geographies, but are such books relevant for Indian investor? Again, what type of book we are reading is very important. A book like the investment checklist or the analyst's best practices, those are generic books. Those are just principles of what to look at while investing. There are books where you talk about investors' biographies, which are of course contextual to that geography. Sadly, we have very few books in India which talk about investors and thought process. They are coming and they will probably keep coming because I think there was a recent book called Masterclass of Investors written by Saurabh Basrara and Vishal Mittal. Very good book which interviews some investors. Then we had India's Money Monarch written way back in the 90s, compiled by Chetan Parikh. Again, an amazing book for looking at processes. But again, these are very small contexts given by small investors, run their personal money and some run public money. But I think it's okay, you find your own investment style. It doesn't matter what context is there. You can learn from everything, you can absorb a lot of things. Maybe somebody has a different process of looking at things which you would not have read which you would not have learned about if you hadn't read that book. So probably reading something will give you 5% of information and knowledge which you can apply. 95% is not useful for you, which is okay. That is the problem with reading anything. But I think from Indian context, India as a country has changed dramatically in 20 years. Of that, half the time I have been investing. So in that time also industry has changed. A lot of disruptions have happened. And these things will keep changing. So context in India today will be totally different. So I agree with the point that reading old books about how things worked out in some industry may not help you. But people don't change. So behavior of people will be the same. Somebody asked a question regarding SoftBank earlier, saying that is there a bubble in valuations of private companies? Yeah, so that is behavior of people. So if somebody invested in today's bubble kind of scenario, they will not get good returns over a period of time. They won't be part of success stories going ahead. How do you identify whether top management of a company is a good or bad for the company? For the company, okay. So capital allocation is very important, but actually a lot of people don't think about it from a strategy point of view. They use it as a residual thought process that after my business needs are met, whatever capital is left, if I want to allocate it, I will allocate it in certain ways, like do a dividend, buyback, acquisition, etc., etc. But I think personalities matter. So like even Vipin was saying earlier that some entrepreneurs will have a different personality, which they will raise far more money than required, or some people will only raise optimum amount of money based on what they were doing. So he also mentioned that there were after parties after raising money and all those things. So I mean, these are the kind of things you need to probably investigate to see what is the promoter or management doing with the time. A lot of times information is easily available. You Google it and see. Sometimes past behavior is documented in terms of penalties and fines. So there are websites which are maintained by SEBI, which tell you that these are the past problems that people have encountered with this particular person or a director of the company. There are multiple sources to understand that. Just going out and talking to people also might help. Standing in front of so it's a consumer business, it's easy to track. You go and see how consumers are consuming the product and what is actually happening, what is the management saying about that. So if you have read 2.2 Capital's research on Manpasand, it's a very interesting investigative study as to what the management was saying and what actually is happening on the ground. So variety of ways to approach this question. I think you should just keep your eyes and ears open. Probably it will help. Information edge, retail versus institutional investing, advantage, disadvantage for each, how to deal with them. I think institutional, so access to management and people really helps sometimes, where you need to just look in the person's eye and ask them specific questions about how they are running things. But retail investors are not actually far behind. So many free platforms are available nowadays. You can just go through everything. Transcripts are freely available. Everything is available. Now the problem is too much information is available. How to filter it, how to train yourself to absorb information is more important than talking about access. And assume that some things you will never find out. So let's not go in that area at all. If you don't know some things, you don't want to invest in that area until you build some knowledge or idea about what that area is. Yeah.
Don't these global IB reports give you guys an edge? Like I see a lot of BOFA-ML research, global reports, and in your slides as well. So if you have a repository of such reports or an access to these, doesn't it give you a very specific edge over the retail?
So there's a story of this guy who was drunk. He lost his keys at night. But he was looking, so there was a street light and there was a light in that small area and he kept looking nearby that light. Somebody asked him, what are you looking for? He said, I've lost my keys. So he helped him look at those keys. I said, but do you know where they fell? I said, they fell somewhere else, but light is here. So we might look at access to information as a availability heuristic. Where, you know, available hai information, that's why it is there. But actually it may not be relevant. Do we really know what is relevant? The whole idea is to filter it out. First, okay, you might get a small short-term advantage over that, but in social media age, everything is shared quite rapidly. So it's not like you have a walled garden of information which nobody has access to. Eventually information will be out and we just have to be vigilant as to what to learn about certain things. So I hope I answered it because there is no right answer to it. So being on the other side, managing institutional money, getting bombarded by reports every time, it does not improve your thought process. It only improves when you sit down and think what is important to understand, how to get that information about the business or understand it. Can you go out and see what is happening? Those things matter. And again, how you evaluate them will be personal. Somebody more experienced will look at something and say, okay, I evaluated this differently than what somebody else said. But there is no comparison of these evaluations.
Actually, sometimes what happens is some companies don't have a con call.
Yeah.
If it's a debt-free company, not even a credit research rating report as well.
Yeah.
So, is there some edge to that as well? Because you have an option to at least contact them.
There definitely used to be. So a lot of people used to go to the AGMs of such companies and talk to the management directly. So at one point there were only that investor and the management at the AGM along with some other investors, and they got the entire access to the management to discuss. Now even that is that edge is gone in many companies, where analysts go to the AGMs now and talk to the managements themselves. So different things will get absorbed. So you will have to figure out which way works. But that dichotomy of retail and institutional, having access is better or not, I think it's not better or worse at face value. How to create network with industry experts or inside company as a retail investor. So it's a challenging point. So I approach this as a retail guy only. I don't think because I'm part of a mutual fund I should be able to talk to people. I go on LinkedIn, I talk to my relatives, I talk to my friends, I see who they are connected on that LinkedIn and see if there is somebody in the industry I want to learn about. I ask them to introduce me. it's more cold calling. Sometimes it works, it doesn't work sometimes, but you have to put the effort, otherwise it will not happen. Sometimes you get lucky, you're sitting next to the plane and someone, that guy is from an industry you're looking at, and you strike a conversation. So for me, it's easy to strike that because I'm a little extroverted, so I can converse with people on my own. But some people have a challenge with that, so you will have to overcome that challenge in networking. So I think you just have to go out and talk to people. I think that is very important. Otherwise, you will not learn. And last question, information edge. हो गया? Oh, nice. Any questions left? Sorry. Yeah. Did I finally answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we started up the presentation with Buffett. So, do you think value investing really works in India? Because as far as I've been investing for almost a decade now, I think it's the growth stocks that have been driving the Indian market, mainly.
So if you look at even Buffett's history, he started with that pure Ben Graham style of value investing, where you buy those nets and liquid balance sheet is bigger than the market cap of the company, all those kind of ideas. They are gone because everybody has figured out how to put them in some algo and these ideas will be taken care of. Even he himself in his life evolved to an investor where he thought about quality, management, running a business with moat and competitive advantage. All these things are not part of the traditional value investing. The school also has evolved. So to keep calling it value investing and associate with some old historical metric of value investing may not be relevant. It will evolve over a period of time as to what value actually stands. And Munger says this, I think, much better than anybody else. He says everybody invests for value only. Nobody wants to buy a company's share and expect the price to fall. Everybody buys for the value to go up. So growth is again a component of that value. If there is no growth, then the value should not be there in the first place in that business to invest in. So I don't think traditional definition of value investing needs to be adhered to.
Actually, I mean to say, low PE, low price.
Exactly. So those will be arbitrage out. So those ideas will not be available. And only in market scenarios where there is extreme pessimism, you might find some good ideas being trading at that valuation. Then liquidity will be a concern for some. So I think retail investors don't need to worry about that. But there is concern of those things also. So valuations need to be looked in the context of what kind of environment you are in. So like he said, there are capital cycles. So right now we are in the peak of some funding cycle. And all valuations are sky high for good businesses as well as bad businesses. Same thing we saw in 2017 where every business was valued at FMCG valuations. Now we see that there is a huge divide of valuations where precipitous decline in small cap, mid caps have happened and yet some of the larger caps continue to grow. Other reasons also are there for that. But to straitjacket yourself into a traditional definition of value investing will trap you in that thinking. This is the only right way. There is not. So that's why you watch that Parijat's algo trading thing. There's so many different ways of doing quantitative investing and not algo trading, quantitative investing. You create different ways of models to track the industry and see what works and do back test if you can. So that idea may not necessarily work because it's an old definition of value investing. I'm waiting between you and lunch, so I understand. Sorry.
So that's a great example you gave about the Excel, blank Excel and with the numbers.
Yeah.
So like personally, due to a personal life, you generally have convictions about things. So if on a blank sheet, I'll be giving a higher number, but if I see the numbers, that will be less. So generally, we will have a more emotional to that. And then when we see with the numbers, there's less conviction. So either you pay less to that company or you skip that emotion. So what do you like in?
I think valuation is very subjective. You cannot say that what you think is valued so and so, I also have to believe is so and so. That's why you get different prices in the market. Generally, it gravitates towards that. So the efficient market hypothesis is all people thinking differently. Generally, it will go into one direction and it will converge. But at some points in time, it will diverge. That's where we can invest. So it doesn't actually matter that what rating you give to yourself of your understanding. But if your valuation metric is right in your mind, you can only invest in so and so areas where valuation has to be so and so at so and so level. I think you will be okay in your style of investing. So first of all, understanding your style is more important as to what suits you and your temperament to manage your risk and your money. Second is in that, what is the valuation parameters which you think have worked? And that requires data. You need to write everything down, map all your transactions. It is not too much effort. People think, "Arey, itna 7 saal ka notes kaise pada?" It's searchable. You go back and search for a specific company, you get everything about that company in your notes and you know what you did. Put a note in the chronological order, so you know exactly what you've done. So I think data should come first and theory later. What we are discussing is theory, and each theory is each person's outlook of valuation. Sorry, I think there's a follow-up question for that. 1 second, sorry.
So what are the tools you use to document that kind of a data?
So
that
I've-
it is searchable when you are.
So I've moved from a lot of tools. So in the past I used to do paper and pen, fill notebooks. Then after 4 years I saw I think 7-8 piles of notebooks this high. And I said, okay, now since everything is piled up, I have no way to know which notebook has what idea. So I, like a fool, scanned everything and put everything into Evernote. And that time Evernote had a new feature for recognizing handwriting also. My handwriting was decent enough to recognize some things, but 80% of the time it did not recognize anything of my handwriting. If I searched a company's name, only 20% results showed up and 80% did not show up. Not a good idea. So I threw all the notes away because they were scanned. From then onwards, I decided to put everything in Evernote. So Evernote is one tool I started using, and now I've moved to Google Drive because Google Drive, I've put the same folder architecture of Google Drive and now Evernote. With Evernote, I don't know if the company will survive financially or not. That's why I don't want that tool to be too dependent on, no, I don't want to depend on a tool. The company chala jayega, product orphan ho jayega, so I don't know. So I went to Google Drive because I think Google might last much more longer, I hope. So I went to Google Drive and I type everything out, and now I use the iPad to write and convert it to text. That's it. I mean, tools are available. It doesn't matter what tools you use. The process is important. Whatever works for you. This works for me because I am a little finicky about technical details. But some people might say, well, I can go back to a notebook and know what everything is. You can label everything. You can index everything. So I don't think it's the issue. Yeah, sorry.
So coming back to the conviction part, so let's say I have an idea and I use some parameters to check that whether to which companies to invest in. So first of all, I'll create a checklist. But in that checklist, let's say a company comes and it does not meet all the points. So the conviction is there not to invest big forms quite easily. That's all. Because some of the checklists were not, items on the checklist
True.
were not followed by that company.
Yeah.
So, but let's say there is a company that falls into all the checklists, right?
Yeah.
Now, then the first question comes is, are the points in the checklist enough?
Yes.
Right. But on that point, when I try to go back and back test each of everything, but then the biases taken, confirmation bias, contrarian bias, whatever.
Yeah.
So my question is that how do you come to that checklist basically, and how do you find out that it's right or wrong, except using back testing?
So one way of doing it is to import somebody else's comprehensive checklist and then remove stuff which is not relevant for you. That is one way of doing it, which is what that book does. It will give you the entire checklist to look at, and then you, based on your investment style, choose what you want to look at. Second way of doing it is, you may have a very comprehensive checklist based on your understanding of how you invest. And in that, say 80% parameters match, that threshold you have to keep, that what points in that checklist are more critical than other points. Like, for example, if management quality is one point of that checklist and that doesn't satisfy, then none of the other points will matter. It will fail itself. So, on absolute basis, you saw that one parameter doesn't match, but everything else matches. The one parameter for you is the most important. For somebody else, it may not be the most important parameter. So, they might also end up investing in that particular idea. I think it is all based on your personal understanding of how you want to invest. And as you evolve, your checklist will also evolve. You'll also realize that I will gravitate these more points to the top. That if these 4 or 5 points matter to me the most, I will look at these points first. And everything else I will look at from a hygiene point of view, that I have covered the business or industry. But checklists are personal, like valuation, I think we should not share them too often, because you will anyway cover the same points. You are going to cover management quality, you are going to cover accounting aggressiveness or conservativeness, you are going to cover business metrics anyway. So those things will anyway be there, but what weight you put to each of these will be totally personal to you.
So I think one point that is coming often and often is, as you evolve, the things will evolve, right? So
Not compulsory. They should evolve.
I mean, it happens a lot. I mean, you learn by experience only. But any tips or tricks you would say for a young investor that you should follow, something like that?
Write everything down. Because you will know only after 5 years what you're thinking at that point in time. See, you can play gully cricket for rest of your life and be competent enough to play only that. But your aspiration is to be like Virat Kohli, but you have not practiced like Virat Kohli. I have mentioned that earlier. So if you improve your practice, the way you practice things, probably that will improve your process also. So this is my way of thinking. Maybe this works only for me and not for anybody else, which is a pity. But if you can pick something up which is useful for you, it will be useful in that context. Yeah. 1 second. Just tell me when the time is up. It's up to you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, so on that 1 to 7 side of it, so the Dunning-Kruger result, by the end of it, you get the answer, it is actually too complicated.
Yeah.
So while analyzing companies, at that point, what pushes you to put that company or business into the, okay, it is actually too complicated, or too hard pipe? What pushes you to actually take it further and then like motivate you to, for you to be able to work on it and then come up with the conviction that, okay, I think it suits my.
So suppose you have never invested in any company before. This is the first time you're opening an annual report. Everything is in that box. Because you have no idea what the business is. Everything is difficult to figure out. As you start reading, you will only decide your own understanding level, and you keep checking it with other people also. That's why you talk to other people. Don't take their views. Like I said, don't use the IMDb approach. Like, what do you think about this stock? Ask a specific question. See, there are some investors who are extremely clued on to management quality and they are very well networked. Find some person like that and ask him, have you heard about this promoter? Have you heard about this CEO? Where do they network? Which club do they go to? Whatever. I mean, there can be so many things. There are some people who are extremely financially savvy. They understand accounting in depth. And if they see the annual report, they will know exactly what is going on wrong with the company. But we will take probably months to figure out कि ऐसा कुछ चोरी हो रहा था company के अंदर. And talk to them about the quality of the annual report, quality of the accounting standard. First, of course, put your effort yourself and then ask a very contextual question. Don't just go open-ended. Then it will go into that I have heard enough category of laziness. Then you will never want to learn more because you got the answer. One logical answer was given to you, so you will move on. So probably try and network with different kinds of people and see what inputs you can get from their understanding. Some people are good commodity traders or investors. They can invest in commodity cycles very well. I have never been able to do that. So I talked to them. How did you see the trigger? Which data points did you track? How did you understand this is the right pivot from where the things will move on? So all inputs are part of the system. At some points, each input will have its own value. So too difficult to box is actually it's a tragedy that sometimes you have to put businesses there. But sometimes they are really difficult to understand and the business models will keep changing very often. Like for example, look at the chip industry. So we all use smartphones and we know for a fact that Qualcomm ka chip rahega hi uske andar. Like every phone will have. But around the corner, like a month from now, there might be a new chip coming up, which probably only the industry insiders know. It's a secret product. It will come and probably in the next 10 years, it will displace the existing product. Which has happened so many times in the technology industry. Then do you really understand the downside of that? Like, you think that 10 years lagega, but why do you want to invest in something which you know is going to fail based on your lack of understanding it? So you focus on the areas you can understand. And probably it's an aspirational thing, but we can't understand everything, all sectors. So you find your areas like what Buffett says, circle of competence, and try and expand it slowly and steadily as you grow as an investor.
So can it be said that
So who knew pharma companies were doing this until people started getting FDA warnings and people wrote a book about what things happen inside the company. So out of things people were saying the pharma industry was this way only. So you had put something in, not that you were able to understand that, and suddenly it went into that I can't understand this anymore because so many complex operational details which you missed earlier. So it's a process. I don't think I have a final answer for it, but I think slowly increasing your circle of competence using technology if you can in some way. I don't know if it works, but it's worth trying. We'll take one last question. Yeah. Slido. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
So what approach do you follow to invest? So usually being an analyst, we start with the financial numbers and then gather information around the investment. So what approach do you follow? Do you look at the management, get comfortable, and then start with gathering more information, or the other way?
There can be multiple sources to the idea. Maybe you ran a screener and you found a company, then you go into the numbers. Maybe you read an article about the management somewhere, you found some idea interesting, so that is starting point for you. Starting point can be any idea. You spoke to somebody and in that conversation some idea came up which you had never heard of, which led you to look at the company and dig more into that. But I think all the things you have to go through anyway. You have to read the annual reports, do the required work to build that opinion that why this company is a good company or a bad company. So I think the source of the idea can be any, but the end result has to be the same, that you have to put some effort to understand if you want to invest in it or not. A lot of times valuation will eliminate the company from the list altogether, because it is good to know, management is good, business is easy to understand and a good quality business, but it's valued at such a level that reading about it right now may be counterproductive. Maybe other ideas are out there which you can read, because we only have a limited amount of time we can devote to these activities. This one question on Slido. So many corporate governance issues ruin investments in India, but how do you foresee these, given hindsight bias is meaningless? It's true. So if somebody has struggled and at a competitive level decided to hide something from you as an outside investor, you will never come to know until it actually blows up in your face. So just like there are professional athletes, there are professional people who hide things professionally for other people. So probably get in that network and figure out who is what. It might help you. Actually, it's very difficult to know. If somebody deliberately hidden something from you, you have to learn to sniff it out. So we can go through checklists like financial shenanigans checklists and all those things. Accounting checklists are there. You can use business understanding, compare relative businesses that in the same industry, one business has disproportionate margin and some other business has, everybody on average has a lower margin. Is there something going on which is not easy to understand? Or are they doing something better, or are they actually lying to shareholders? Some questions you can ask, but then you may not always get the answers that you want. So yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint that this is exactly what is going to ruin, but sometimes it's obvious. Like sometimes you will have a trend which is so blindingly obvious, like receivables growing faster than the sales growth or profit growth, or no operating cash flow for a long amount of time and yet business is showing net profit sustainably and growing net profit. All these things you can question, and based on that you can either stay away or investigate further to know if you want to short the company, that is. I think the questions are done from Slido. Cool. Thank you guys.
So on behalf of the audience, thanks again for a very good, insightful session and the presentation, and obviously a host of recommendations that you have given on movies and books and documentaries. So I'm sure the weekend is packed. So thanks again, and I'll request JC to give away the gift to Ronak. Absolutely. Yeah, very difficult to figure out for a voracious leader like you, which could be possible books.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Please do join us for lunch, and I hope you are available. Ronak is available for.
Yeah, I'm here till 3 o'clock.
So that's great. Do keep giving us your feedback, and hope to see you all for our next event on the 8th of November, Value Investors Conference. Thank you.